For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4618.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
House Calendar Number 99, H.R. 4618, a bill to designate the federal building and United States Courthouse located at 121 Spring Street Southeast in Gainesville, Georgia, as the Sidney Osland Smith Jr. Federal Building and United States Courthouse.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Cabello, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Carson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 4618.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 4618 would designate the federal building and United States Courthouse located at 121 Spring Street Southeast in Gainesville, Georgia, as the Sidney Osland Smith Jr. Federal Building and United States Courthouse. Following his service in the United States Army during World War II, Judge Smith received his law degree and went into the private practice of law. In 1965, he was appointed to the federal bench as a judge for the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia by President Johnson, and he served until his retirement in 1974. Given his commitment and dedication to our nation and the law, I think it is fitting to recognize his service by naming this courthouse after him. I want to thank my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his leadership on this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also support H.R. 4224, which designates the United States Courthouse in Gainesville, Georgia, as the Sidney Osland Smith Jr. Federal Building and United States Courthouse. Judge Smith served as a federal district court judge in the Northern District of Georgia and was a World War II veteran. Judge Smith graduated from Harvard University and the University of Georgia Law School. After graduating from law school, Judge Smith went into private practice, as was noted, and he practiced until 1962 and was later elected as a Superior Court judge in Georgia. In 1965, Mr. Speaker, Judge Smith was appointed as a district court judge and was later elevated to chief judge. Judge Smith stepped down from a federal bench in 1974, as was noted, and returned to private practice as a partner at an Atlanta law firm. In addition to his very long and distinguished career, Judge Smith was an active member of the educational community in Georgia, serving as chairman of the Gainesville Board of Education, a chairman of the State Board of Regents, and as a trustee of a university for 35 years. Judge Smith was well respected in his community, and it is very appropriate to name the building in Gainesville, Georgia, the Sidney Osland Smith Jr. Federal Building and United States Courthouse. I also support this bill, Mr. Speaker, and urge my colleagues to join me in voting for this important piece of legislation. I reserve the balance of my time, sir.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my friend from Florida for yielding me the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 4618, legislation that I introduced to name the federal building and United States Courthouse in Gainesville, Georgia, after Judge Sidney Osland Smith, or Sidney Smith as we know him. Judge Smith passed away, but his influence in my hometown of Gainesville is still felt. He was born and raised here in Gainesville and committed to the law and furthering education. Judge Smith dedicated his life to serving the public. He joined the Army during World War II to serve his country. He later went on to have a distinguished legal career after receiving his law degree from the University of Georgia. And he was in private practice in Gainesville for many years and served as Superior Court judge prior to being appointed to the federal bench by President Lyndon Johnson. Judge Smith's appointment to the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia included time as chief judge from 68 to 74. After leaving the bench, Judge Smith served in the community in many other ways. He served on the board of Brenau College, which is now Brenau University, and played a pivotal role in helping the school obtain university status and become a doctoral granting institution. Judge Smith's legacy is one that deserves to be honored. And as the judge's son has said, he said serving others was his vocational calling. The federal building and courthouse in Gainesville is a symbol of public service and civic duty. Judge Smith dedicated his life to the high ideals of justice, honor, and family, and the naming of the courthouse after him will keep his legacy alive for years to come. It will serve as a reminder of the judge's commitment to his community, and I believe help inspire others to public service. You know, Mr. Speaker, as we've just heard from my two friends and colleagues here about this man, Judge Smith, it goes beyond the resume, and it starts to talk really about the law degree and the private practice and the Superior Court judge. In fact, my father was a Georgia State Trooper, remembers Judge Smith before he was on the federal bench. But I think what is most special for me in doing this and working with my friends and the fellow senators from Georgia in the Senate to name this building is not only did he do his service, but then he would come back to the community. It was out of a duty that he served on the federal bench. He then came back out of the federal practice. He served a law firm. He helped in our educational community. Brenau University is worldwide known as a former women's college. It has now expanded its program and reach to literally all across the world, recently expanding to China and having an influence there and all over Georgia. But it's also that commitment to business and this commitment to his hometown. You see, when we name buildings, and I don't take that lightly, it should be in honor of someone who touches all aspects, not just their federal service, not just maybe their private service, but a combination of two. Because when we go into high schools, and Mr. Speaker, I know and my colleagues do as well, we speak in high schools and elementary schools all the time. We talk about pride. We talk about public service. And Judge Smith is one of those in my community that we can point to and say, here is someone who serves his country, who served his fellow members of Georgia in the bar, but he also was known at home. They knew him in the restaurants. They knew him on the town square. That is someone we can look to. That is someone that we can take pride in and saying, there's someone who I take and identifies with the very ideals of American life. And it is for that reason, it is real easy for me to say this is something that we do in honor of someone who earned his honor while he was living. He earned it through his hard work, his dedication, and his commitment to his fellow man and also to our beloved community in Gainesville. So I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation to recognize Judge Smith by naming this building in Gainesville the Sidney Austin Smith Jr. Federal Building and United States Courthouse. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time as well, sir.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues for coming to the floor today in support of this legislation. Clearly, we are taking the opportunity, and the House has the opportunity before it, to honor a man who inspired his community, who served with honor, and who, quite frankly, is a role model, was a role model to so many in the state of Georgia. So I would respectfully ask all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 4618? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to consider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass House Concurrent Resolution 119.
The clerk will report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Calendar Number 102, House Concurrent Resolution 119, Concurrent Resolution authorizing the use of the Capitol grounds for the Greater Washington Soapbox Derby.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Cabello, and the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Carson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Concurrent Resolution 119.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, House Concurrent Resolution 119 would authorize the use of the Capitol grounds for the Greater Washington Soapbox Derby on June 18th. I want to thank the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for introducing this resolution and his longtime support for this event. This annual event is designed to encourage children to show off their work, ingenuity, and creativity as they compete for trophies. These races have been run nationally since 1934. Today, they are held throughout the country, and a few are held throughout the world. The winners of each division are then qualified to compete in the All-American Soapbox Derby in Akron, Ohio in July. I support passage of this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to thank my good friend from Maryland, Representative Hoyer, for introducing this resolution on behalf of the Washington Regional Delegation. This annual competitive event, Mr. Speaker, encourages boys and girls ages 9 through 16 to construct and operate their own soapbox vehicles. The event has become a great tradition in Washington, D.C., the metropolitan area, over the last 20 years. It provides a terrific opportunity for children to appreciate the workmanship necessary to build vehicles and enjoy the thrill of competition. The Greater Washington Soapbox Derby organizers will work with the architect of the Capitol and the Capitol Police to ensure that the appropriate rules and regulations are in place, Mr. Speaker, and that the event remains free to the public. I support this resolution and urge my colleagues to vote for this resolution and this legislation because it's critically important for the future of our children. And, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as he may consume to my very good friend, the distinguished Mr. Hoyer from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank both Mr. Cabello, the chairman of the subcommittee, and the ranking member for moving this resolution forward. I think this is the 25th year that I've sponsored this resolution and have had great support throughout, and I thank them both. I'm proud to rise, Mr. Speaker, in support of this resolution, which I sponsor each year on behalf of the Washington Metropolitan Delegation to permit the Greater Washington Soapbox Derby Association to hold its annual race on the grounds of the Capitol building. This is a very special year, Mr. Speaker, for the Soapbox Derby as it celebrates its 75th anniversary. For 3/4 of a century now, young people from across the greater Washington, D.C. area have assembled at the Capitol for a fun, educational, and exciting event. First run in 1938, when Norman Rocca sped past 223 of his fellow young racers on New Hampshire Avenue to capture the first Soapbox Derby victory. The race brings together those between ages 8 and 17 to compete in 3 divisions. Those divisions are stock, super stock, and masters. The winner of each division will qualify to race against the regional champions from across the country later this year at the All-American Soapbox Derby in Akron, Ohio. This year's race, Mr. Speaker, here in Washington will take place on June 18th. There's a reason, of course, why the Soapbox Derby has been called, quote, the greatest amateur racing event in the world. Not only because it is a thrill to watch on race day, but because of everything that happens before race day as well. For weeks in advance, the young drivers and their parents, and yes, sometimes grandparents, gather in garages and basements to build, test, and improve their soapbox racers together. It is a process that brings the generations together and teaches valuable lessons about hard work, science and engineering, sportsmanship, leadership, and pride of achievement. Mr. Speaker, many of the skills learned in building these soapbox racers are the same ones that help students succeed at the science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM subjects, as we refer to them, that will prepare them for success in college and careers. In addition to bringing families together, the Soapbox Derby brings entire communities together with civic groups, police and fire departments, service organizations sponsoring participants in whom they see the future leaders of their communities and of our country. Mr. Speaker, I said before that this is the 75th anniversary of the Greater Washington Soapbox Derby. It also marks, as I said, the 25th year that I've had the honor of sponsoring this resolution. I've done so because I am incredibly proud of the tradition and of all the young people from Maryland's 5th District who have participated year after year. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I say with some degree of pride that the 5th District has been home to many Soapbox Derby champions, including the winners from 2007, 2008, 2009, 2012, 2013, and 2014, which is to say recently we've done pretty well, Mr. Speaker. Our racers even brought home national championship victories in 2007 and 2008. I want to thank all of those who worked to make the Greater Washington Soapbox Derby possible. I also want to thank the co-sponsors of this resolution, Representative Chris Van Hollen, Jerry Connolly, Don Beyer, John Delaney, Eleanor Holmes Norton, Donna Edwards, and Barbara Comstock. And I hope the House will offer its strong support once again for this great American pastime and all those young people and their families who participate. And I yield back and thank the two gentlemen for their leadership.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the gentleman from Maryland on the 25th anniversary of him bringing forward this resolution. The gentleman from Maryland is someone who respects the traditions of this House and who, through his example, I think, teaches younger and newer members to also respect the traditions of this House. And I'm proud to support this resolution today and to urge my colleagues to do the same. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Indiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 119? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.